already made like about 10 or so videos so far. And it's pretty present throughout the whole Gospels. You can see in the Old Testament, you can see in the New Testament, how the Synoptic Gospels come back into affirming, right? He sent himself, he doubled down so many ways. I actually saw one of these videos of questioning verses that counteractively or contradict Jesus' claims to being God, or anybody's claims that Jesus was God. And one of them was happened to be Luke, where it was quoted where he grew in stature. So we're going to focus on that a little bit, not too much, because not really much can be said for here. And in this video I was watching, you can see in the link somewhere, whether it be in the description or on the screen. And it was pretty interesting because there's explaining how God grew with his human nature to show that, it's not just purely divine. There's some aspects of him being present with the human and divine nature. Yeah, just show a little clip to see how it ends up. And the only really true problem with this is this could be immediately dissensated with the same author. Luke wrote Acts, and if you look in Acts 3:15, the KJV translation says I believe it says the author of life, and whereas the other translations say creator or other terms similar to it. And so essentially we're immediately after the same author that is conveying that Luke and Acts being the same author is strictly conveying that they killed Christ. And then from that point on forward, not only does Acts open up that way, every single letter from Paul also addresses the church that the reason they're able to be united and one with Christ is because of Christ's sacrifice. So it's really easy. It's probably one of the verses that's just clear. Christ was crucified. It's not a new concept, but the fact of the author of life, you can just make a really sincere comparison. Author of life, which means creator, which means Jesus is God, because from this point on, right after literally immediately after the Gospels, we know that he was crucified, and it's that who's referring to. Who else is it about? So yeah, it just doesn't take too much. It's just really that simple. You can go in a long, elaborate way, like I've done in the videos prior, or you can just present something that is very sincere and straight to the point. These claims are really fallacious, if I have to say. Both elaborate and simple. So let me just explain a little bit. Known in this particular sphere, where a lot will quote with John 8:58. But truly, truly, I tell you, or verily, verily, I tell you, before Abraham was, I am. And for those that are outside the faith, they don't know what exactly that is. Claiming to be pre-existent in some way, where they use a person speaking from the Pharisees and the scribes, that before your forefather, which it's Abraham at this point of perspective, before he even existed or thought, I was there. And so this is kind of similar to what John 1 already conveyed at the opening, where he was pre-existing. Colossians 1, which is happening a little bit later, it's conveying that God pre-existed before creation. He's not a byproduct of creation itself. And since Jesus is affirming that, he's doubling down that not only was I there with Abraham, I was there before he was a thought, and I'm also claiming the same divine name, which you can find in Exodus 3:14. There, it's the bush. It comes of the angel of the Lord. Moses interacts with it and tells him what he has to do. And when Moses asks, "What I tell the people, like what's your name?" It's essentially the same name that their God. For most people, that's pretty much it. They just call it a day and then just pack it up. This actually refers to something much more elaborate than just that. So this is the first part. Obviously, that's the more simplistic view of an explanation. You can just end it there, or you can go more further in depth with it, because to claim that not only is he claiming that the divine name, he's referring to a specific day. So if you look at John 8, he actually refers to a specific day, and Abraham witnessed it and experienced it, and he was glad when he saw it. And so there was obviously a point in time that obviously he's referring to in the scriptures what he means by that. And so I love to actually use this with people that happen to be Muslims or Jewish, anybody who quote unquote is in the Abrahamic faith, because I have to say that because Islam technically is not an Abrahamic faith. It just proves to show that Abraham actually interacted with God in the flesh in the Old Testament. What he's referring to is actually in between the chapters of Genesis 16 all the way to 21. When we start off with Genesis 15, this speaker, this person, right, the word of the Lord came, we get to see that's been identified. It gets identified basically in the next chapter, right, Genesis 16, where the person that's speaking to Hagar is basically God himself. So this speaker identifies as angel of the Lord, which is by this point most Christians know as a pre-incarnate Jesus. And it also refers to basically like a subtlety in the New Testament when it comes to Romans 10:13. And then there it just explains that when we call unto the name of the Lord, God is doing the same thing what the New Testament is conveying. We see this in earlier documentation, especially specifically in the book of Genesis, where God does the exact same thing, where she called upon the name of the Lord. It's not like some kind of random creature in existence. It's actually God himself being referred to as angel of the Lord. And also it starts off in Genesis 15 as the word of the Lord came, so you can see that there's an introduction of making that distinction between God himself and then anything else besides him. And so we do see this person exercise a corporal form. You can see this really in Genesis 17 as this person approaches Abraham and does these things that require physical attachment. It's a specific location. He's meeting face to face. Even asks Abraham to walk before him because, we went from Hagar transitioning over to Abraham. And here from this point on forward, we're going to see the perspective of Abraham and by extension Lot as well. Going on forward, how God interacted within the New Old Testament, not only in heaven, but also on earth. And here, if you actually read a couple of verses forward, specifically between 16 and 22, you can see that God makes it to be known that this time next year we're going to meet again. And there he's going to say this time next year we're going to meet in the exact same place. So a location on the earth is taking place and a specific time. So, we got a time and place. Same thing if I did a colloquial with the person. I was like, hey, we're going to meet at this where we first met, which like, let's say a mall at this time next year. That's kind of hard to get around where Abraham interacts a person that obviously has a form. It's not just a disembodied spirit or receiving it from just purely a word of God, because I think what's super important is if that was the case, it wouldn't open up certain times mentioning subtleties of how it's introducing yourself, how it's being addressed, and how it's interacting with the world itself, whether it be through a prophet, this and that. Here in Genesis 17, you can obviously tell that this person is interacting in a physical sense. Flip into the next chapter. The actual year has been passed because from this point on forward, Abraham actually recognizes God doing something in a place, and he actually comes up to him and starts worshiping him. And so this is why, earlier I mentioned with evangelizing Jews and Islams and anybody in that same note, because God actually had a pre-mortal existence before in the person of Jesus. If we were all to assume that we're all sharing the same prophet, one of them, especially the first patriarch of the faith itself, of the fulfillment of what we know to be known as Christianity, he actually comes up to a person and worships this individual. And so to reconcile it, you can understand that if we read 15, 16, 17 and up to now 18, you get to understand that there's multiple instances that this person is being addressed as God, identify himself as God, and now is being worshipped as God. Really, I'm just getting a summary, and I suggest you do read it yourself and you can connect the dots where he gets invited to a physical place. Abraham actually invites him to his abode. They do some normal Jewish customs where they invite him, give him a place to eat, wash their feet. And so this person that's being addressed by God, and no, it's being accompanied by two people. So you can see that with the introduction of the word, the angel of the Lord, and this person, you get to see that God is always present in the form of three, but still being singular. So even the Trinity is still present, even in Genesis. This person, which we're just going to refer it to a pre-incarnate Jesus, is eating and drinking, being in a physical place. He's interacting with Abraham and Sarah in this corporal form. So it's really difficult to see that when you read it, like every 8 to 10 verses or so, they are just really interacting with the world itself, past beyond what the humans do, because we obviously interact with the world like we're doing right now. I'm recording in front of my phone and this and all that, but there's also being that's God as well is tangibly doing things in some type of form like we do to some extent. Here it shifts on to what it's going to be elaborated in a couple of chapters afterwards. God is actually telling Abraham that, hey, I'm going to judge Sodom and Gomorrah because the other two went ahead to do what they needed to do. And he's just conveying to Abraham, like, hey, I'm going to judge this place. And so Abraham, expecting the worst, he actually started to talk with God. Long story short, they kind of go back and forth. I'm like, hey, can you spare if you find X amount of people? I start with 50. And Abraham talked all the way down to 10, because knowing that a whole nation, right, doesn't really say how big this place is, but is to assume like more than a city level kind of thing. He noticed that not even 50 people can be righteous there. And so the fact that he went from, imagine like millions and millions, if not more, being reduced down talking to 10 shows that even in the earliest accounts of the Bible, you can see how truly evil and corrupt and fallen humankind is. This person is claiming and conveying to Abraham that he's going to judge Sodom and Gomorrah, only what God can do. And we see instances, of course, of this Jesus doing as well, where it says, I judge no man, but yet if I judge, it is true. Something similar that has been doing on from time to time again, linking that this person that is Jesus Christ is not just a creation, not just a son, but is also part of co-equal, co-eternal of the Godhead, which we know as the Trinity. The same thing happens, right? God basically says, "This is what I'm going to do. If I find 10 enough, I'll do it." Spoiler alert: He doesn't. However, there are some righteous people, which is kin of Lot. He was righteous. And what's very interesting about that, I probably have to make a video, how Lot was still considered righteous, even though he committed atrocity. And that could be a different video in the future. Definitely look forward to that. But nevertheless, his family, his wife, and his 2 daughters were considered righteous. God couldn't actually judge the world until they left the city. And so later towards that chapter, they were actually guided into another city. And the moment they entered that new place, Sodom and Gomorrah were finally judged. And if you actually read that chapter, specifically in chapter 19, there the Lord on earth called the Lord of the heaven to judge Sodom and Gomorrah and to send a fire. So here is a clarification. How can we reconcile this quote-unquote discrepancy or this contradiction? Because Jews and Christian worship one God. We can see in Deuteronomy 6:4 that God was always one. So when we read this is actually like the other persons of the Godhead interacting with each other without names or titles. The only thing we see, the Lord on the earth and the Lord on the heaven, I guess you can consider as that title. It's just to separate that the God that's above and the God that's below are it's not just like one. It's not singular. It's actually singular being, but like being done by 2 persons. That's why there's a distinction between being and person. I've already made videos prior to that, so if you haven't watched it, again, I recommend you do so to understand the difference between being a person. Once that's all done, God goes back to what Abraham said, because he knows when you see what I have done, you know what exactly has happened. He has judged Sodom and Gomorrah. There weren't 10 righteous people. There was actually 4. And he actually did not judge the righteous with the unjust, and he separated, and then he do so. And so when he came back, because he did say in chapter 18 that he was going to come back, and when you see me, that's how now you will bear Isaac. Okay, and so all this elaborate conveying is that it's very subtle. A lot of people miss it, especially those that lack understanding and, unfortunately, the Holy Spirit, because it's clearly indicating that God is coming back and flexing his physical agency. You saw he comes in, addresses Abraham, makes it to be known. They do some physical things, says, I'll come back in this time in this place. You'll recognize me. Yeah, Abraham does, goes to him, even worships before him, invites him to his home. They do other things like eating, washing of the feet. Then he goes outside, and then off in the distance, they see in the city, and it says, hey, I'm going to judge it. And when I come back, that's how you know you'll bear Isaac. I'm going to fulfill that promise. It's not impossible for me. What's going to essentially come out of it? What is the outcome? And so when we read it at the chapter, was it 21? Because I believe 20, it just talks about really what just happened with Lot a bit when it comes to the 2 daughters. Not really going to get into that. That's another interesting talking point. Regardless, we know what ends. God comes back like he said he would. For the 3rd time, if I'm not mistaken. Abraham sees it, and that's how he knows that, Sarah is pregnant with their child. Not because, they took a test and this and all that. When he saw God there physically, right, like he did in the previous 2 times, visiting him, that's how you know, oh, I have my son Isaac. It's very difficult to just get around that, like, hey, is there existence of the Trinity before? Well, yes, in the Old Testament. Not only does it subtly indicate in Genesis 1, but actually becomes very elaborate between chapters 15 and 21 of Genesis themselves. So therefore, when we go back to John 8, now we understand with all this entire context what Jesus is actually referring to. Abraham saw me on the day. That makes even more sense why the Jews critique, You're not even 40 years old. Like, if you want this to be believable, at least be in a certain age that we could assume that maybe we were dating the things wrong. This didn't happen like thousands of years ago, if not like maybe within a century or two. Maybe that could have been believable. And that's why when Jesus actually clarifies and solidifies by doubling down, this is a common thing that God, on that day he saw and he was glad. He was talking about Jesus Christ judging Sodom and Gomorrah. It's not only just God, it is also Jesus Christ judging, because he is God himself. If we actually place Jesus in that person that Abraham worshiped and invited, you wouldn't be incorrect. Jesus actually claiming to be the same individual that Abraham worshipped and judged Sodom and Gomorrah, the one who gave Abraham Isaac. He actually solidifies it again when the Jews were ready to stone him, after he says before Abraham was. So even going further back than him judging Sodom and Gomorrah, I am. So he's claiming that title that only is seclusive and exclusive. I guess it's the same word. I'm kind of being redundant using both terminologies. That person is God. Jesus Christ is God. And so that's why it warrants that reaction. Obviously, you can just end it as verily I tell you before Abraham I was, and then he's closing I am, and he's claiming the same title, but he's also referring to a specific date. So all those passages that I have referenced so far, that is actually what is being referred to. Jesus judging Sodom and Gomorrah and being the same God that Abraham worshipped. And so that's why it elicited that reaction of the Jews to pick up the stones. Like, how can you be? It's like impossible for us. It's really unfortunate, because think about it. Pharisees are super dedicated. They know the scriptures so much, but even with that, they couldn't understand that the same person is claiming to be this, and then they completely miss it, because unfortunately they do lack that thing that God rebuked them time and time and over again. You can be intellectually smart, you can be the person that knows everything, but if your heart is not reflective of how much you love God instead is hardened, you become these certain individuals that instead of understanding and worshiping Jesus as God, you want to actually kill the person that is claiming who he's proving to be. It's more than just him just stating that I am God. He doesn't need to do so. He's actually doing it through the scriptures, because there's some sort of familiarity. In that same sense, if I were to recognize somebody that I actually personally know, let us say like my own father, he will do some things that he has done in the past only I would know, and that I'll hold it to heart and to verify I'm like, oh, this is God, rather than just taking their word for it.